Okay, welcome back, team. This topic that we're going to focus on now is a little bit of a hodgepodge of things that I want us to make sure that we include in the strategies and curriculum design course. Very important topics that we pick up and things that I wanted to share with you um, so that you have this information and knowledge moving forward. So, topic three is going to be the RIDL framework, strategies for active engagement in the classroom, and then classroom orientations for a positive classroom. So let's start with our focus question, like always. And for the focus question, I just want you to think about what kinds of classroom experiences encourage your multilingual learners, your English language learners, to think critically, participate actively, and connect personally with texts. I just wanted you to reflect on that, think about that before you get started with this module. Because in this module, we're going to talk about the following topics. By the end of it, you should be able to explain and apply the reading for in-depth learning, the RIDL framework, to promote deep, meaningful engagement with a variety of texts. You should be able to select and implement instructional strategies, including the critical insight cards, beach ball technique, debates that actively engage multilingual learners in collaborative discussion and critical thinking. And then finally, I'm going to ask you to be able to reflect on characteristics of a positive learning environment and identify ways to foster these characteristics: openness, voice and agency, curiosity, creativity, and interconnectedness in your teaching and your students' learning. Okay, so let's get started here with RIDL, the RIDL framework. So, first of all, just a little bit of information about where this comes from. This comes out of Sunny Lau's work, and she published this with colleagues in 2025. This is her latest model about RIDL, or reading for in-depth learning, this framework. And where this comes from is you have to understand that oftentimes in ESL classes or classes with multilingual learners, unfortunately, at times, deficit perspectives about these learners can lead teachers or the school or the program to maybe underestimate what these learners can do because they're still developing their English proficiency, right? So sometimes it's equated that, students who are still learning English perhaps can only function at a surface level. And we want to push back on that notion and really emphasize these learners' abilities to think critically, to create new things, and to transform their communities. And so, along those lines, Riddle provides teachers with a framework to think about and kind of interrogate our classroom and our practices to see if they are truly moving students in that deeper engagement and content. Okay, so many classes that I have observed of English as second language classrooms, and that is primarily here in the United States, so not EFL but ESL. The classroom teachers often focuses on discrete grammar skills for the entire 90 minutes. For example, I observed a teacher focusing on uses of commas. Okay, in another class, it was just on pronunciation and using, kind of going through words, practicing words with partners, practicing words with flashcards, just working on pronunciation. And while these might have a place in your classroom, we really want to move beyond that with our learners and just thinking about how can we engage them in analyzing, questioning, interpreting, and critically thinking about complex texts. And of course, we're going to provide appropriate scaffolding depending upon their English proficiency. So when I say text, a text can be anything from a novel to a poem to a short story to a fable to anything also multimodal. So thinking about images, websites, songs, um, right? It could be a mixture of those. It could be more than one of the mediums. And so we want to engage our learners around our instruction should focus on one of these texts. And then utilizing this riddle framework, which I'm going to unpack for you now, it really helps us design instruction that promotes both language development, but also deep, meaningful engagement through text. So let's look a little bit closer at the riddle framework. So you can see here, it's kind of in the shape of a heart with the four chambers. And we're going to start with this textual side. So the role of the teacher is to really set up the environment and to invite students to notice and wonder about looking at textual features specifically, maybe the word choice that authors use. Maybe it's a repeated phrase or repeated word in the text and wondering what the purpose is of that. It's also thinking about descriptive language use, what images are created for the learners as they read the text. They want to think about what the text tells us about point of view of the author. It also should, we should be able to analyze the tone of the text. What's the tone of it? It should also, we should invite our students to look at the organization of a text. How is it set up? Does it jump right into the middle of a story, or does it begin with like the exposition and move that way, right? Also, just kind of keeping in mind these stylistic devices like the use of metaphors or symbolism or irony. What is the role of those devices in the text? How are they functioning? Any visual elements that go along with the text, or maybe it is just a visual element, right? And then any multimodal features like sound and music or movement or the design of the text in itself. So first we want to just really invite this close look at the word, the phrases, the sentence level of the text, and then everything else kind of going on around it, including those stylistic devices and any multimodal features. So that's textual, and that kind of makes sense, right? That's that really kind of surface level that we would engage students with probably first, although there is no exact order that you have to follow. It can be kind of reiterative. Then we could move into personal, or we maybe start with personal and then go to textual, right? Again, there's no set order. But personal just asks students to consider why this text matters. Why is your teacher asking you to read this text or understand this text? And also, why might this text matter to other people? Maybe it's people in the community, maybe it's people in their classroom, right? So, kind of considering multiple perspectives. You want to invite students as the teacher to share what they already know or things they have experienced related to this topic. We've talked about the KWL chart previously, where we talk about what students know, what they want to know about a topic. You could also invite them to do research on the topic in their first language, perhaps by going home and talking to mom or dad or their caregivers, or looking at a video or reading a short article online that's in their L1, just to build and kind of trigger that background knowledge before you dig into the topic in English to make those connections. We also want to invite students to connect the text to their own lives, just thinking about do they share a similar experience or emotion, or maybe like the relationship that's in the story, or a tradition, or even a challenge or a barrier that has been experienced by characters in that text. Next, there's different connections. So we're going to ask students to make a connection, text to self, that's text to their own lives, text to text, which is making connections to other texts, and then text to world, kind of going outside the classroom. How can they connect the text to what's going on in the larger social, political, human rights, immigration issues that are going on around in our community? And then, even though it says personal, it's really inviting them to explore multiple perspectives and just thinking that through the point of view of other people in their community that they care about, right? Maybe their teacher, their classmates, their family, would they also experience this same text in a similar way or in a different way? So, kind of inviting that very critical perspective. And so, right away, you can see we're going beyond just the literal level of a text, like comprehension questions, and really trying to make connections between text and what the students know, value, experience. Okay, the next one that I want to look at is this critical element, and then we'll go on to the creative and transformative element. So the RIDL framework sets us up to invite students to recognize that no text is neutral, that all texts really do share the perspective of that author and perhaps the society in which they're created, right? and they're for a particular point of view and context and goal that we may or may not be aware of as a reader. And so we want to really invite our students to develop that awareness about, as it says here, invite learners to investigate how the text positions the reader, meaning like, who are we as the reader supposed to look up to or admire or value or respect? Who in the story or the text are we supposed to maybe not trust, not like, right? How are those people depicted? In what ways are they described? And then just kind of keeping in mind that no text tells the whole story. So what's left unsaid? Whose voice is present? Whose voice is missing? Who are the people in power? Who are the people without power? Right? And then just considering that maybe people would interpret the text differently if they came at it from different experiences, different cultures, different values. And so really the goal here is helping students think about how they could question, challenge their own understanding of a text. So it's really kind of turning back on the learner and just saying, just self-assess and to think like, is there what's missing? What more could there be here? Whose voice isn't included? Whose story isn't included? Would other people from other cultures interpret this in a similar way? Why or why not? Right? And then after you do those first three, usually creative transformative is going to perhaps be at the end. But again, this can kind of cycle back again across all four of these dimensions. So we had textual, kind of looking specifically at the word level, phrase level. Then we had connections to personal, right? Making connections to our own experiences, making connections between texts, and making connections between text and society. And then this critical perspective in terms of, not critique in like that traditional notion of the word, but more like just thinking through what is it that the author is trying to portray to us and just kind of being a little bit more wary of falling into whatever they're setting up for us and considering instead like are there other ways to respond to this text? The last piece is how students respond, and that's the creative and transformative piece. And so, as the teacher, if you're following this RIDL framework, it's really nice because more than just like answering questions and pointing out vocabulary words from a text, you're inviting students to think about what they want to do now that they understand, have discussed, have read, have thought about a particular text. Again, remembering that a text can be many different things, right? It could be an infographic, it could be an image, it could be a poem, it could be a short story, it could be a fable. And after doing that, thinking about how they're going to create something new, a response in some way to what they have learned about the topic that they've learned about. And then think about how they're going to transform perhaps something about this issue, the problem that is perhaps illuminated through the text. So as it says here, we want students to think about and ask themselves, what will I create or do after experiencing this text, reading it, understanding it, discussing it, unpacking it, right? How will my students, as a teacher, communicate new ideas, solve problems, advocate for change, or contribute to their communities after reading and understanding and reflecting and thinking critically about this text? So you can invite students to respond in a creative way, to maybe they write an alternative ending to the story, or they rewrite the story from another character's perspective, or they create something new like a podcast, a video, a poem, an artistic rendering, a dramatic performance, right? There's so many varieties on how students can create something. And then together in community, they could brainstorm possible responses to the important questions that are brought up, the issues, the problems, and kind of decide what do we want to do about it. And perhaps choose something and act to address the issue. And this acting doesn't have to be something that's, this huge thing like running for president, but really a small response to what they're experiencing, right? So these are a few texts that I am using. This one here in the left-hand corner currently with some ESL teachers where they are looking at, and we're actually helping them think about how they would use this with their ESL middle school and high school students here in the United States. But these are graphic novels written by immigrant newcomers to the United States who have told their story about, how they got to the US. And so, this could be an example of a text, like one of those short stories, a graphic short story, told through the perspective of a student's eyes and illustrated. And just thinking through, okay, what does this mean about immigration and refugees and education and that intersection? And what do we want to do about that if that's something that we want to do something about, right? And so just considering critically, whose voices are here, whose voices are missing. Is this the whole story? What other components might be missing here, right? And so really exploring, thinking critically about the text. I included some of the favorite texts that I use with some of my pre-service teachers, My Forbidden Face, We Are Not From Here, and Inside Out and Back Again. These are all excellent texts. If you haven't read them yet, I encourage you to do so. I also included a poem that I've used a lot with my English language learners. It's called From by George Ella Lyons. You might be familiar with this poem. And she just essentially writes kind of her memories of where she's from and with this very descriptive language. And a lot of times I would have my students write back to that, remembering where they are from with similar types of descriptive words. But we can also consider, whose perspective is this and whose perspective is missing, and would how would people from different cultural backgrounds respond to this poem or understand this poem? And then the last three are children's books that could also be a nice text to explore issues about environmental protection, the rights of education, and then, of course, equality among different cultural and religious groups. So, choosing a text and being creative as a teacher is also a part of the RIDL framework because in the middle here of the heart, it's really important that you select a variety of texts that appeal to students in different ways, cognitively, effectively, and socially, and reflect oftentimes, who they are or community members that they might know or issues that they might be also concerned about in their community, right? And to use a text to really bring your ESL class to a much deeper, comprehensive level that's not just this surface level of comprehension and grammatical structures all the time, right? Okay. The last thing I'll say about this in terms of the riddle framework is the use of these critical insight cards. I had the opportunity to work with this author. Her name is Jennifer Alford out of Australia. And she created these cards actually with newcomer students in Australia, where she lives in Brisbane. And they came up with questions, which are printed here for you. And then they were illustrated by design students from their university that the students then would take these cards and use them to kind of interrogate or think about, question a text that they had in small groups, asking themselves, like, what is this text about? Right? What's the topic? How do I know? Maybe adding to that, what do I already know about this text or this topic, rather? Who wrote it? Who benefits from the publication? Right? Does the author benefit from it? Does the audience benefit from it? Is there somebody else who benefits from it? How do I know that? What are they getting? So this is just something for you to explore and think about. Again, bringing your students to a much higher critical level than that surface level of pronunciation, discrete grammatical skills, right? That really don't serve our learners in any way. This is much more communicative, much more engaging, and really honors, the work that they can do, even though they're still developing their English proficiency. Okay, kind of segueing into why it's also important to have movement in the classroom. So we know engagement is so important, active engagement, but really like physical movement also connects to cognition. There's been a lot of research about this that to keep our brain at peak performance, our bodies also have to be at peak performance. The two go hand in hand. So we want to incorporate movement into classroom activities especially for our younger learners who have that shorter attention spans. Breaking up their learning and incorporating learning with movement is really key. Okay. Let's see here. This is talking about active learning and how important it is that students are, doing in class, not just passively listening. There's a great video here by Rankin, Dr. Rankin, who talks about active learning in general. I encourage you to take a look at that. And just a couple of strategies I wanted to share with you that are active and just to kind of, again, add some tools to your toolbox. But one of them is the beach ball technique. And maybe you've seen this before, but this really is effective with shy learners, with lowering the affective filter in the classroom. You take a toy like a beach ball. And in this case, they have words written on it. And when you throw it, wherever your hands touch, the students have to use those words to answer the prompt. So there's a lot of varieties on how you can do this. I had a kind of a ball like that, or it was actually a squishy dice, and on each side of the dice it had a different verb. And so as they threw the dice around the classroom, whatever verb they touched, they had to use that in a response. So it's a bit of a warm up, but it does involve movement. It involves them throwing the ball and some laughter. So it's a great way to also lower that affective filter, as we've talked about, is so important. Another strategy that we haven't had a chance to discuss yet that I wanted to bring into this module was using debate in the language classroom. Debate is a wonderful way to get learners to engage orally, but also it requires a bit of research. So it also can incorporate reading. And if you have students write down their notes, writing, obviously, and then during the debate, not only are they speaking, but they're also listening to their classmates. So important, right? And can be very communicative as long as you're giving students the option to, choose the side of the debate that they would like to defend. There's a great list here from the New York Times of debate topics, which I included some of them here. And so, you could start with something, very light, like do cats or dogs make better pets, to something that would be a little bit more, thought-provoking. Does technology make us more alone, for example? And what I love with the access to internet is that the students can get access to content to support their pro or con side, or you as the teacher could also organize that so that they have particular things that they need to read or listen to or watch prior to their debate. And then just I'll briefly mention the inside out circle because I know that that came up in a previous module. And reviewing that if you would like to and seeing this image, there's also a great video about that. Along with Jigsaw, same thing, an excellent strategy that includes active learning, movement, all right? It definitely involves all four skills, reading, writing, speaking, and listening, as well as tickets out the door, which we talked about in our assessment module. That great video on mud cards or tickets out the door, I prefer, as well, can provide you with some more suggestions for how to do that. Cocktail party is a fun kind of variety that you might throw into your class where students actually have a writing dialogue instead of a spoken dialogue where they take turns writing back and forth to each other and passing the paper around the class. That can be really fun. It's a great way to start class. It can be a good way to get to know each other or to review vocabulary. And then again, just coming back to our good old favorite, think, pair, share, turn and talk, and how important that is to incorporate peers and peer interaction in our classroom every single class. The last thing I want to discuss with you comes out of the work of Kara Viesca. And Viesca and her colleagues came up with this graphic to talk about orientations for a positive classroom climate for diversity. It's kind of a long title, but it really relates nicely to the caring that we talked about and designing our environment, setting up our environment for learning that we've talked about in a previous module. But I also like this in terms of kind of thinking about your classroom and your teaching and just reflecting about these components, these orientations. So, openness would be that the teaching and the learning embraces multiple knowledges with grace. I love that expression, embraces multiple knowledges with grace. To me, this is really saying that you accept students with their previous knowledge and experiences, the funds of knowledge that we've called before, um, the capital that they're bringing from their community or their family, and incorporating that into the classroom as something valuable, an asset rather than a deficit. Interconnectedness talks about the humanizing teaching and learning that produces belonging. To me, this interconnectedness is that, teaching can't be just top down, but teaching is reciprocal. So, teachers and learners learn from each other, right? The teacher learns a lot from their students if they're open to it, just like students can learn from each other, but also from the teacher as well as teach the teacher and each other. So very much, this is a human endeavor, and that's why, we need humans interacting with each other to really have this type of positive interaction that's reciprocal. So important. Agency talks about, choice. So just like I don't believe that teachers should have a scripted curriculum. Same thing. I don't think students should only have, one correct answer or one way to show their knowledge or one choice for a project. How can you work in student voice and student agency in your classroom? Is that something that you provide? Do you provide a lot of choice? Do you provide multiple ways for students to show that they know something, or is there just one right way? And then the last two are lovely, right? Curiosity and creativity. These seem like, yeah, it's a natural part of any classroom, but not always. Curiosity, as Viesca defines it here, is teaching and learning for growth through exploration and inquiry. And that's why I love also how this connects to the RIDL framework from the beginning of this module. Because if students are thinking critically about a text, if they're making connections between a text and their own experiences or another text or the world around them, that's curiosity. Um, if they're not doing that, if they're just practicing, pronunciation or repeating after the teacher or looking at flashcards of vocabulary words, there is no curiosity. There's no creation, right? So, building that into your classroom, I think, can be a really important goal. And then creativity. We want teaching and learning to generate possibility and transformation. This is a really hopeful view about learning, about how we can transform the world around us, how we can better take care of one another in our spaces, and how we can really be generative in our new knowledge. So I just invite you to think about these different orientations in terms of thinking about how am I creating a positive classroom? Do you have these different orientations? Is there one that maybe comes easier to you in your practice? And is there maybe one or two that you'd like to perhaps cultivate into your classroom, into your practice? And just thinking about, how might I do that? What might that look like? So, just planting a lot of new ideas for you here in this module, everything from the riddle framework to these orientations to additional ways to engage our learners actively, collaboratively, creatively in our classroom and and having choice in multiple ways of showing what they know. So, such exciting things. Just there's such variety that you can do with your students. And I just want to really encourage you to think outside the box in terms of just doing basic grammar or, basic conversations in the restaurant. Like, how can you go deeper with your instruction with these students? Because they really do have the capacity. And just to note that not only is it good for them in terms of their critical thinking development, but it also side by side really develops that language because it's communicative, it's meaningful, it has a real purpose. So thanks for listening. Thanks for being along on this journey, and I will see you next time. Bye.